Good morning and welcome to the second episode of the Countdown to 2030 podcast, this Friday, the 31st of July, 2020. My name is Greg Justice, Chief Sustainability Officer for the California Green Academy. Our theme for the podcast is Bay Breeze by the artist 43, and you can find out more information about the podcast at our website, Countdown-to-2030.dev. Also known as CalGreen, the California Green Academy is a nonprofit 501c3 organization with the mission of promoting systems thinking and the triple bottom line in business, energy, and transport. CalGreen oversees four major programs: the sustainable transportation blog TransportiCA, nonprofit studies, educational, and consulting services, the Regional Business Association Sustainable Chamber of Sacramento, as well as our newest program, Nonprofits for the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as NPOs for the SDGs. Again, for additional information about the California Green Academy, please go to the website www.calgreenacademy.org. So our agenda for today, the majority of the podcast, we're going to talk about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the SDGs, and those were agreed upon in 2015. So we'll discuss them individually and also provide you an update with them. I'm going to also talk about TransportiCA's book club selections for July and August. We're going to follow that with CalGreen's Codifying Sustainable Transport campaign, an update of it. We started it last month, and we've actually sent out letters to members of the legislature, so I'll provide you any feedback we've heard so far. And lastly, we'll conclude with House Resolution 1024 and the UN 75th anniversary as it relates to. You can find all the videos and the slideshows for this podcast and every podcast at our website at www.countdown-to-2030.dev. Again, that's countdown-to-2030.dev. So again, the majority of today's podcast will be about the Sustainable Development Goals, otherwise known as the SDGs. But before we start with that, I actually want to give you a mention of the predecessor to the Sustainable Development Goals, and that was the Millennium Development Goals, agreed upon in 2000 and which took effect from 2000 to 2015. So if you're seeing our slides right now, you can see a picture of 149 heads of state meeting together at the UN headquarters in New York City. This was for the Millennium Summit that took place from the 6th to the 8th of September 2000. And at the end, all heads of state adopted the Millennium Development Goals. So there are 8 goals, the first being eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. The second goal, achieve universal primary education. The third goal, promote gender equality and empower women. The fourth goal, reduce child mortality. The fifth goal, improve maternal health. The sixth goal, combat HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. The seventh goal, ensure environmental sustainability. And lastly, the eighth goal, global partnership for development. Now, the entire mission of the Millennium Development Goals was to end poverty. The official phrasing was, "We can't end poverty." And it was agreed upon by 189 countries. Now, although the prior picture showed 149 heads of state, again, it was actually agreed upon on September 8, 2000 by 189 countries at the United Nations. It included 21 targets for which were the measures to, or were the outcomes and end goals for each of the goals, and also 60 indicators that quantified the outcomes and the measurements for how we were going to achieve each of the goals. Now, even though they're over, they ended in 2015, you can find more information on the Millennium Goals on the UN's website at www.un.org/Millennium Goals. Again, that's un.org/Millennium Goals. So that ended in 2015, and that same year, the United Nations agreed upon the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals was one part of the 2030 Agenda. It also included the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was the financing mechanisms for putting forward the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. And then in December of 2015, it included the Paris Agreement, which allocated, or not so much allocated, but set aside individual goals for each country to meet as far as meeting emissions goals. And so all three of those, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, are a part of what's officially known as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So now we actually want to play you a video, and this is from the United Nations, titled Transitioning from the MDGs to the SDGs.
In the year 2000, leaders from 189 countries agreed on a vision for the new millennium. They wanted to end extreme poverty in all of its forms. So they made a list of 8 goals, called the Millennium Development Goals, and they wanted to achieve these goals in 15 years. One of the leading organizations working to fulfill these goals has been the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP. We're present in more than 170 countries and territories. We championed the goals so that people everywhere would know what they were and how people could do their part. We funded projects that helped fulfill the goals. We helped countries accelerate MDG progress by breaking down the silos and working across sectors. We acted as scorekeeper, helping countries to track progress. As a result, the number of people that live on less than $1.25 per day has dropped by more than half. The number of primary school-age kids who don't go to school, down by almost half. The number of people getting life-saving treatment for HIV increased by over 15 times. Child mortality, down by almost half. As much progress as we have made together, there's still a lot more to do. Over 800 million people are still living on less than $1.25 a day. 1 in 9 people on our planet goes to sleep hungry each night. Deforestation remains alarmingly high in many countries. Oceans are becoming more acidic, threatening food security and marine ecosystems. And about 1 of every 6 adults in the world is illiterate. 2/3 of them are women. We think those are tough numbers, and so do leaders from the countries where we work. So in September 2015, they agreed on a new set of goals to help finish the work we all started in 2000. The new goals are called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. We have made significant progress in the last 15 years, and we think there's plenty of room for hope, for action in the next 15 years. Today, the world is more connected by technology. We know more about how to balance the 3 pillars of sustainable development: social progress, economic growth, and environmental protection. However, our climate is changing. Our planet is transforming, and there are more people on Earth than ever before. We at UNDP believe everyone can have enough of what they need living within our planetary boundaries, and we are working around the world to make this happen. Our goals to reach by 2030 are to eradicate extreme poverty, protect our environment, and much more. UNDP has 50 years of experience working with countries to make this a more prosperous, healthy, inclusive, and sustainable world. Join us.
So as the video mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals took effect in 2015 and lasting until 2030. Some background on it: there's 17 goals. I'll go over them individually momentarily. It was agreed upon by 193 countries, so 4 more than the Millennium Development Goals 15 years earlier. The mission was leave no one behind. Unfortunately, with the Millennium Development Goals, it was narrowly focused on populations, especially in developing countries and least developed countries. For the Sustainable Development Goals, every country was included, because even developed countries have development issues and needs that need to be taken care of. As well, this was not solely for developing countries, like I mentioned, this was for every country. Despite the nobility of the Millennium Development Goals and the success they brought, the Sustainable Development Goals were making sure that everybody was included um, in this 15-year agenda. It was also a multi-sector approach. The Millennium Goals just focused on the public sector, but the Sustainable Development Goals focused on the private sector, the public sector, civil society, and so forth. It included comprehensive targets, a total of 169, as well as comprehensive indicators, a total of 231. There is officially listed 243 indicators, but there's actually 12 that are repeated. So it makes the count of indicators actually 231. And the last thing about the goals, accompanying with the Paris agreements, it provided country-specific emissions goals. So as I mentioned, the emissions goals in the Paris Agreement were the targets to get to. The Sustainable Development Goals were actually the mechanisms for achieving that. And the Addis Ababa action agenda was how we go about paying for this, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector as well. So while I go about individually listing the goals and their targets and indicators, I'm also going to reference in it a report that came out just this month. And this is from the United Nations Association of the United States of America. They're a separate organization that's meant to complement the mission of the UN and also the UN Foundation. And so beginning in January of 2020, they actually set out to do UN 75 consultations with members all across the nation to figure out what do they imagine as being a better future, what will the future look like, how are the Sustainable Development Goals going to play into that, and so forth. So I'll be referencing those and providing quotes from individuals in various regions regarding respective Sustainable Development Goals. So again, these consultations took place nationwide in UNA USA's 11 regions. There were a total of almost 1,900 participants in it. And funny enough, the region that CalGreen Academy is in, the Mid-Pacific Southern California, actually provided the most consultations with 545 consultations, or almost 29% of that. So here we go with the goals. I'm going to tell you the short name and then also the formal name of the goal every time we reach a new goal. So number one, its short name is known poverty, but its title is actually End Poverty in All Forms Everywhere. Now there's 7 targets related to number one, and I'm actually going to read for each of the 17 goals, only 3 of their targets. So I don't think I'd have the time to do 169 of them, but I'll just read 3 to give you a better example of what they are. So again, there are 7 targets with goal number 1, 3 of which include 1.1 by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. Target 1.2 by 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty, and in all its dimensions according to national definitions. And lastly, target 1.3, implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, and by 2030, achieve substantial coverage of the poor and vulnerable. So goal 1 actually has 13 indicators. Again, these are the objective frameworks to actually measure we are reaching our progress toward each goal. I'm going to read off 5 of them. I'm not going to read every single indicator for the goals, just for goal 1, but this way you have a better sense of what they are. And these are short indicators, so that's why I'm going to read off 5. The first being 1.1.1, proportion of the population living below the international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographic location, meaning urban or rural. 1.2.1, proportion of population living below the national poverty line by sex and age. 1.2.2, proportion of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. 1.A.2, proportion of total government spending on essential services, such as education, health, and social protection. And lastly, 1.B.1, pro-poor public social spending. Now, some of the indicators have letters in it, and some are strictly by numbers. I'm not sure what the differentiation is, but hopefully I'll find out in a later podcast and share that news with you. Moving on to goal 2, the short name is Zero Hunger. It's also known as Ending Hunger. It actually has 8 targets, 3 of which include by 2030, end hunger and ensure access by all people, in particular the poor and people in vulnerable situations, including infants, to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food all year round. A second target, by 2030, end all forms of malnutrition, including achieving, by 2025, the internationally agreed targets on stunting and wasting in children under 5 years of age, and address the nutritional needs of adolescent girls, pregnant and lactating women, and older persons. And lastly, a third target is adopt measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets and their derivatives, and facilitate timely access to market information, including on food reserves, in order to help limit extreme food price volatility. So those are a part of the 8 targets for 2. Goal 2 has 14 indicators as well. So goal 3, the short name is Good Health and Well-Being, and its long title is, quote, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Goal 3 includes 13 targets, and they're actually divided into 3 groups, and that's the group of child, second group being maternal, and the third group, HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. And again, there are 13 targets, 3 of which are by 2030, reduce the global maternity mortality ratio to less than 72 per 100,000 live births. By 2030, end preventable deaths of newborns and children under 5 years of age, with all countries aiming to reduce neonatal mortality to at least as low as 12 per 1,000 live births, and under 5 mortality to at least as low as 25 per 1,000 live births. And lastly, by 2030, end the epidemics of AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and combat hepatitis, waterborne diseases, and other communicable diseases. So those are 3 of the 13 targets for goal 3. It also has 20 indicators. That actually has the most indicators for any of the goals. So moving on to goal 4, its short name is Quality Education. It has 10 targets, 3 of which include by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and goal 4 effective learning outcomes. A second target includes by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so that they are ready for primary education. And lastly, by 2030, ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university. Again, those are 3 of the 10 targets for goal 4. Goal 4 also has 12 indicators, and we also have our first quote from the UNA USA consultation report. And regarding goal 4, it's, quote, give the tools and education to elected officials to create more equal legislation, including women's perspectives, and then have national and international governments take the lead from what cities have put in place, end quote. And that quote comes to us from Brian in South Dakota. Thank you so much for that quote. For our goal number 5, the short name is Gender Equality, but the title is Achieve Gender Equality, Empower All Women and Girls. Now, 5 has 9 targets, 3 of which includes end all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere. A second, eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. And lastly, eliminate all harmful practices such as child, early, and forced marriage and female genital mutilation. So that's 3 of the 9 targets. Goal 5 also has 14 indicators accompanying it. So for goal 6, the short name is clean water and sanitation. Its formal title is ensure access to water and sanitation for all. It has 8 targets, and 3 of those targets include by 2030, achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. By 2030, achieve access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all, and end open defecation, paying special attention to the needs of women and girls and those in vulnerable situations. And lastly, support and strengthen the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. Those are 3 of the 8 goals for Goal 6, and Goal 6 has 11 indicators as well. So goal 7, affordable and clean energy, that's the short name. Its formal title is ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. Now, this is a very grandiose goal, but there's only 5 targets associated with this goal. I'm not sure why. If I find out, I'll give you that information in a future podcast. But 3 of the 5 targets include by 2030, ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. By 2030, increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix, as well as by 2030, double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. Now, again, there's only 5 targets with that. There's also only 6 indicators, which I'm not sure why that is, but I'll report to you as soon as we find out more information about that. So goal 8, its short title is decent work and economic growth, and its formal title is promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. There are 12 targets for goal 8, 3 of which include sustain per capita economic growth in accordance with national circumstances and, in particular, at least 7% gross domestic growth per annum in the least developed countries. A second one being by 2030, devise and implement policies to promote sustainable tourism that creates jobs and promotes local culture and products. And lastly, strengthen the capacity of domestic financial institutions to ensure and expand access to banking, insurance, and financial services for all. So those were 3 of the 12 targets for Goal 8. And Goal 8 also includes 16 indicators. This is the 3rd most amount of indicators of all the goals. So Goal 9, known as Industry, Innovation, and Infrastructure, its formal title is Build Resilient Infrastructure, Promote Sustainable Industrialization, and Foster Innovation. It has 8 targets with that, and 3 of which include develop quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure, including regional and trans-border infrastructure to support economic development and human well-being, with a focus on affordable and equitable access for all. Another target includes promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and, by 2030, significantly raise industry's share of employment and gross domestic product in line with national circumstances and double its share in least developed countries. And lastly, a 3rd goal, increase the access of small-scale industrial and other enterprises, in particular in developing countries, to financial services, including affordable credit and their integration into value chains and markets. So again, that is 3 of the 8 targets for Goal 9. Goal 9 has 12 indicators. Goal 10, reduced inequalities. Its formal title is Reduce Inequality Within and Among Countries. There are 10 targets associated with this goal, 3 of which include by 2030, progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. The second, adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage, and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality. And lastly, by 2030, reduce to less than 3% the transaction costs of migrant remittances and eliminate remittance corridors with cost higher than 5%. So again, that's 3 of the 10 targets for Goal 10. Goal 10 also has 14 indicators. And again, I want to remind you that we have videos and slides associated with this With every podcast, you can find that at our website at countdown-to-2030.dev. So moving on to Goal 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, formerly known as Make Cities Inclusive, Safe, Resilient, and Sustainable. Goal 11 includes 10 targets, 3 of which include by 2030, ensure access to all adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. Strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. And lastly, support least developed countries, including through financial and technical assistance in building sustainable and resilient buildings utilizing local materials. So those are 3 of the 10 targets for Goal 11, and Goal 11 also has 14 indicators. Goal 12, Responsible Consumption and Production. Its formal title is Ensure Sustainable Consumption and Production Patterns. And Goal 12 has 11 targets, 3 of which include, by 2030, achieve the sustainable management and efficient use of natural resources. The second being, by 2030, substantially reduce waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reuse. And lastly, promote public procurement practices that are sustainable in accordance with national policies and priorities. So those are 3 of the 11 targets for Goal 12, and Goal 12 also has 13 indicators accompanying it. Goal 13, Climate Action, formerly known as Take Urgent Action to Combat Climate Change and Its Impacts. Goal 13 has 5 targets. Again, like with Goal 7, it has a small amount of targets and indicators. Not sure why, but if I find out, I'll let you know. But 3 of those targets include: first, strengthen resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries. Second, integrate climate change measures into national policies, strategies, and planning. And lastly, improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warning. So in addition to the 5 targets, there's also a recognition within Goal 13, acknowledging that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. So those are 3 of the 5 targets. Goal 13 also has 8 indicators. And here's our second quote from UNA USA, the UN 75 consultations. And this quote is, invest in local community leadership with deep relationship building and indigenous knowledge at the center. And that comes to us from Ruth from Alaska. Thank you for that quote, Ruth. Here we go, Goal 14. We have 4 more to go. And 14 is life below water, also known as conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources. Goal 14 has 10 targets, 3 of which include, by 2025, prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. A second target, by 2020, sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including by strengthening their resilience and take action for their restoration in order to achieve healthy and productive oceans. And lastly, minimize and address the impacts of ocean acidification, including through enhanced scientific cooperation at all levels. So those are 3 of the 10 targets for Goal 14. It also includes 10 indicators as well. Goal 15, Life on Land, the formal title is Sustainably Manage Forest, Combat Desertification, Halt Reverse Land Degradation, and Halt Biodiversity Loss. So Goal 15 has 12 targets. They're actually divided into 3 groups. The first group, forest, the second, desertification, and the third group, biodiversity. And 3 of those targets include: take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of natural habitats, halt the loss of biodiversity, and by 2020, protect and prevent the extinction of threatened species. Next, promote fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. and promote appropriate access to such resources as internationally agreed. Lastly, take urgent action to end poaching and trafficking in protected species of flora and fauna and address both demand and supply of illegal wildlife products. So again, that was 3 of the 12 targets for goal 15. It includes 14 indicators as well for that goal. So goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Formal title is promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. There are 12 targets for goal 16, 3 of which include: first, significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. Second, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. And lastly, develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels. So again, that's 3 of the 12 targets for goal 16. The goal also has 24 indicators, which is the second highest amount of indicators, followed by goal 3. We also have another quote from a UNA USA member, and that quote is, "If systematic racism in policy and public health are not addressed and changed, we will not improve for all people." That comes to us from Morgan from Illinois. Thank you so much, Morgan, for that quote. And lastly, Goal 17, Partnership for the Goals. Its formal title is Revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. Now, this is the largest. There's a total of 19 targets for Goal 17, and they're divided into 5 groups. The first group being finance, second, technology, third being capacity building, fourth being trade, and the fifth group, systemic issues. And among systemic issues, there's actually 3 subgroups as well. The first is policy and institutional coherences, the second, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and the third, data monitoring and accountability. So I'll read you some of the 19 targets. They include strengthen domestic resource mobilization, including through international support to developing countries, to improve domestic capacity for tax and other revenue collection. Adopt and implement investment promotion regimes for least developed countries. Enhance global microeconomic stability, including through policy coordination and policy coherence. And lastly, enhance the global partnership for sustainable development, complemented by multi-stakeholder partnerships that mobilize and share knowledge, expertise, technology, and financial resources to support the achievement of sustainable development goals in all countries, in particular, developing countries. Now, again, those are actually 4 of the 19 targets for Goal 17, and Goal 17 has 24 indicators. This is tied with Goal 16 for the most amount of indicators, just behind goal number 3. And now we come to the last quote regarding Goal 17, and it is, the SDGs as a whole show a holistic view of how to reach our ideal future, and the increased mobilization and activation that we've seen in the US lately gives me lots of hope for this future. And that comes to us from Carly in Ohio. Carly, thank you so much for that quote. Very timely and very inspiring. Now, I also want to provide you some feedback. Again, the UNA USA did their UN 75 consultation starting in January. They did it nationwide to 11 regions, almost 1,900 people, but California Green Academy is headquartered in Sacramento. We're in the Mid-Pacific and Southern California region. So we wanted to provide you some information for that, what the consultations were for this region. And the region only includes 3 states, California, Nevada, and Hawaii. I'm not sure why Southern Pacific territories are not included, but if I find out, I'll give you more information on that. So as far as regional consultations, the Mid-Pacific and Southern California region actually reference the most sustainable development goals for future responses. They believe that a total of 15 out of 17 goals are most important for us moving forward. And I actually want to provide you one of the quotes from the respondents from these consultations in the Mid-Pacific and Southern California region. And the quote goes, quote, "We want a world where respect of human rights and social justice is a lived reality, where discrimination and racism are eliminated, a future world where governments, judicial systems, and economic policies put social and human development at the center, end quote. Now, I'm not sure who that's attributed to, but a very powerful quote, and I thank you for that. If you want to get a hold of this report and actually all of the responses from consultations in the entire 11 regions, you can go to UNA USA's website, and that's unausa.org/UN75 hyphen report. Again, that's unausa.org/UN75 hyphen and the word report. While you're there, there's also a great webinar that took place last month on June 26th. That's actually UN Charter Day. And this June 26th in particular is was the 75th anniversary of the celebration of the signing of the UN Charter, which took place at San Francisco, again, June 26th, 1945. So if you go online to UNA USA's website, you can download the webinar that featured Her Excellency Amina J. Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General for the United Nations. So she's the second in charge. She talked about the future with the SDGs and how we're moving forward as a nation, speaking in US terms, but also as a world, toward achieving the SDGs and what history must do in order for us to fully embrace that. In addition to having Deputy Secretary General Mohammed speaking, it also features live musical performance by world-renowned opera singer and decorated humanitarian Dr. Simon Estes. He's actually from Ohio, a wonderful voice, and he provides 2 performances on that. So I encourage you to go onto UNA USA's website and check out the webinar. Now, as far as the progress, this month, the United Nations issued their 2020 progress report for the goals. Unfortunately, we are behind, and not just behind, but spectacular behind. Even the goals that included 2020 targets, most of which will not be met. I believe about only a quarter of the 2020 goals have been met. So the website for that is located on our slides. If you go to the UN's website, un.org, you can type in SDG Progress Report 2020 and it will pull it up. There's also links on our website for that. So sadly, we are very behind on achieving the goals, not just for 2020, but for 2030 as well. With this being the case, Secretary General Antonio Guterres actually established what's called the Decade of Action, and that's starting now in 2020 and going until 2030, and putting as much effort as we can into putting the goals forward and also putting them as the priority of governments and the private sector and civil society around the world. That's also why we began this podcast, Countdown to 2030, to do our part to encourage the adoption and administration of all 17 goals and how important it is, not just in humanitarian affairs and human rights, but also in environmental protection and peacekeeping as well. So I'm going to play you now a video from Secretary Guterres, and he's going to talk about the need for the SDGs and the Decade of Action.
The Sustainable Development Goals are the world's action plan for a fair globalization and a better future for all. We have 10 years to bring that vision to life, and we can only get there together. That is why we have launched a Decade of Action to deliver the goals, to overcome poverty and inequality, to combat the climate crisis and advance gender equality, to build peaceful, just and inclusive societies free of discrimination and hate in harmony with nature. Join us, step up, seize the moment, and let us work together to meet the goals, move our world forward, and leave no one behind.
And again, if you want to go to our website at countdown-to2030.dev, you can see the videos in our slideshow that's associated with each podcast and this podcast in particular. So for the Decade of Action, if you're looking for more information on that, you can go to the website un.org/sustainable development/Decade of Action, and you'll get more information about that. Now, next month on August 9th will actually be the International Day of the World's Indigenous People. So I want to close off this segment bringing attention to that. You could actually go onto the UN's website under their observances listing and look for the Indigenous Day web pages. Again, it will take place next month on Sunday, August 9th, but the formal ceremony from the UN headquarters will take place on Monday, August 10th at 11 p.m. Eastern Time. That's UTC minus 5 hours. So this is an important day to recognize the rights of the world's indigenous people and also to recognize the fact that there are still a lot of adverse happenings occurring with indigenous people. So about 476 million people worldwide are indigenous. That's almost 6%. And really, we need to be doing our part in this decade in obtaining or working toward the Sustainable Development Goals on respecting the rights of the world's indigenous peoples. And also a wonderful reading, if you have the time, which I would strongly encourage you, is to go onto that website and also look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's also known as UNDRIP. So let me conclude this segment with another video from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he'll talk to you about the Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, as well as what they're facing right now with the COVID-19 pandemic.
COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on more than 476 million indigenous people around the world. Throughout history, indigenous people have been decimated by diseases brought from elsewhere to which they had no immunity. It is critical for countries to marshal the resources to respond to their needs, honor their contributions, and respect their inalienable rights. Prior to the current pandemic, indigenous peoples already faced entrenched inequality, stigmatization, and discrimination. Inadequate access to health care, clean water, and sanitation increases their vulnerability. Indigenous peoples work primarily in traditional occupations and subsistence economies or in the informal sector. They have all been adversely affected by the pandemic. Indigenous women, who are often the main providers of food and nutrition for their families, have been particularly hard hit with the closure of markets for handicrafts, produce, and other goods. We must also urgently address the plight of indigenous children who do not have access to virtual learning opportunities. Around the world, indigenous people have been at the forefront in demanding environmental and climate action. Lapsed enforcement of environmental protections during the crisis has brought increasing encroachment on indigenous people's territories by illegal miners and loggers. Many indigenous people have been victims of threats and violence, and many have lost their lives in the face of such threats. Indigenous peoples have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Indigenous communities, with the autonomy to manage their lands, territories, and resources, have ensured food security and care through traditional crops and traditional medicine. The Karen people of Thailand have revived their ancient ritual of Kro Ye, or village closure, to fight the pandemic. Such strategies have been applied in other Asian countries and in Latin America, with communities closing off entry to their areas. Realizing the rights of indigenous people means ensuring their inclusion and participation in COVID-19 response and recovery strategies. Indigenous peoples must be consulted in all efforts to build back stronger and recover better. From the outset of the global pandemic, United Nations agencies have been working to uphold indigenous peoples' rights. We have been helping to safeguard health and safety and provide access to social protection and economic opportunities. The United Nations system remains committed to realizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to bolstering their resilience.
And as always, we just want to remind you that if you'd like to access the videos or the slides that accompany every podcast, you can do so on our website at www.countdown-to-2030.dev. Again, that's countdown-to-2030.dev. Now, I want to talk to you about the TransportiCA Book Club selections for this month and also for next month, August. We're going to tell you in advance what August selection is. It's one day, but still it's in advance. We don't normally do that. And so this is actually the 5th year of the book club. It began in July 2016. And so from July 2020 to June 2021, we celebrate the 5th year with the Year of the Female Author campaign. And this is completely dedicated to, for every monthly selection, celebrating the unsung voices of transportation and infrastructure female authors. Now, if you want to find out more information about this, you can go to the website, calgreenacademy.org/Year of the Female Author. Again, that's calgreenacademy.org/Year of the Female Author, all one word. So for July, we chose a great book. We wanted to get back to the basics where we teach about transportation and infrastructure and so forth. And sticking with that theme, there was a wonderful selection. It's called Next Generation Infrastructure, Principles for Post-Industrial Public Works by Hilary Brown. So it's published by Island Press, one of our great publishers for sustainability and transportation and so forth. Now, Professor Brown is the founding principal of the firm New Civic Works and professor at the Bernard and Ann Spitzer School of Architecture at the City College of New York. Previously, she served as assistant commissioner for New York City, where she was founding director of New York's Office of Sustainable Design and led publication of the city's nationally recognized high-performance building guidelines and high-performance infrastructure guidelines. Professor Brown currently serves on the National Research Council of the National Academy's Board of Infrastructure and the Constructed Environment, and she's also a fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute. So besides the not basic, but the elementary understanding of transportation and infrastructure, how to move forward, Professor Brown's book also touches a lot on the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's actually 8 in particular that the book does a wonderful job in profiling. And those are beginning with Goal 6, clean water and sanitation, Goal 7, affordable and clean energy, Goal 8, decent work and economic growth, Goal 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities, Goal 13, climate action, Goal 14, life below water, Goal 15, life on land, and lastly, Goal 17, partnership for the goals. My apologies, I said prior there was 8 goals. There's actually 9 goals referenced in Professor Brown's book. So moving forward to August, we actually, not only is this timely, but it's also, again, wonderful and continuing with our Year of the Female Author, but we selected Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And this is by Angie Schmitt. This is also an Island Press publication. And again, not only is it timely, but it's also a wonderful book about transportation planning, sustainable transportation, and pedestrian safety. So again, it's by Angie Schmitt. Schmitt is a national expert on sustainable transportation and pedestrian safety and was the longtime editor of Streets blog. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Bicycling, Good, and Landscape Architect magazines, and many others. Schmitt is also the founder and principal of 3MPH Planning and Consulting, based in Cleveland. And again, like with our July selection, next month's selection deals with 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So those goals are first, Goal 3, good health and well-being, Goal 10, reduced inequalities, Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities, Goal 13, climate action, and lastly, Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Now, as part of the August selection, we've actually asked Angie Schmitt to provide us with a nonprofit that she wanted to profile. So in case many of you don't know, next month on Monday, August 17th is National Nonprofit Day. And the nonprofit that she chose to profile is actually called People for Mobility Justice. It's a wonderful nonprofit. It was founded in 2018, and its mission is, quote, as a Black, Indigenous, people of color collective, we seed critical consciousness about mobility justice across all communities, end quote. And the vision is, quote, people have the freedom and resources to move in public spaces with love and dignity. Now, again, this is a wonderful organization. We asked Ms. Schmitt to profile a nonprofit that she feels really brings light and profiles what she's trying to bring forward in her book Right of Way. And this was the nonprofit that she thought best captured her vision. Now, although it's based in Los Angeles, their work is actually nationwide, and you can support the groundbreaking work on mobility justice and transportation equity with a 100% tax-deductible donation, and that can be made at peopleformobilityjustice.networkforgood.com. Again, that address is peopleformobilityjustice.networkforgood.com. And again, that's a 100% tax-deductible donation and can be made securely and safely online. So August is National Nonprofit Day on Monday, August 17th. We want to give you some history in case you haven't heard of it. It was actually started in 2017. There's a lot of understanding that it began last century. That's not the case, or it's more than a century old. It was started by Sharita J. Herling. She is actually a nonprofit expert, grant consultant, and business strategist, very well-known individual in the nonprofit sector. And currently, she's also founder and CEO of Creative Images Foundation. So Ms. Herling created National Nonprofit Day in 2017. And in particular, she chose August 17th as the date. And that's entirely based on the passage of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act of 1894. Now, the act itself was passed August 17th, 1894, and it became law on August 28th of 1894. The reason Ms. Herling uses August 17th as the date is the Tariff Act was actually the first act of Congress that placed taxes on corporations, but it was also the first act that provided tax exemptions for charities and other nonprofit organizations. So Ms. Herling, with doing National Nonprofit Day on the 7th, she's bringing forward basically a thank you for nonprofits and celebrating the incredible work that's done by the social sector and nonprofit organizations every day. So we're very thankful for that. Again, that's National Nonprofit Day next month on Monday, August 17th. And with our TransportiCA Book Club, we ask you to consider a donation to People for Mobility Justice. That website for donations is peopleformobilityjustice.networkforgood.com. Again, that's peopleformobilityjustice.networkforgood.com. And as always, we want to go ahead and again remind you that there are slides and videos that accompany this podcast episode and every podcast episode. So if you'd like to download them or take a look at them, you can do so at www.countdown-to2030.dev. Again, that's countdown-to2030.dev. Now, last month's episode, we introduced the California Green Academy's new campaign called Codifying Sustainable Transport. And it's an effort to have defined in state statute, particularly the California Streets and Highways Code, the definition of sustainable transportation. So surprisingly enough, despite the leadership in environmental protection and climate change with California, it's actually not defined in statute with a universal definition under framework. So we're pushing forward CalGreen Academy to actually have it defined in order to, again, present a universal framework and at the same time also have other organizations and governments then adapt to this definition, as happened in 1994 with President Clinton's definition of environmental justice, and later California adopting that in law through Senate Bill 115. So as I mentioned, there is no universal definition of sustainable transportation. There is a universal definition for sustainable development and sustainability that comes from the Brundtland Commission's UN report for the Commission on the World Commission on the Environment from 1987. But the California Green Academy, using the Brundtland Commission and also integrating John Elkington's concept of the triple bottom line from 1997, we've actually come up with the definition of sustainable transportation as, quote, resilient mobility whose energy or input is renewably based, financial operations are secure, accessibility is universal, and emissions or output have minimal to negative impact on the ethnic, social, and natural systems affected by such mobility. So we sent a letter earlier this month on the 22nd to uh, Governor Newsom, the 50th governor, the 40th governor of California. And we basically explained we support his issuance of Executive Order N1919 that was issued by him last September in 2019. And it called for the state to invest nearly $5 billion in sustainable transportation through investment and planning and so forth. But at the same time, we put forward in our letter, there is no legal definition of what sustainable transportation is. So there is not even a regulatory scheme in any of California's regulations, even in our major plans and executive orders that have been issued prior, there is no definition for the word sustainable transportation. So while we applaud the governor's effort and the administration's call to actually do that, to invest in sustainable transportation on that scale, we do feel that it actually hurts everyone, the fact that there's no universal framework or definition involved. And so that also lends itself to for-profit corporate interest and those opposed to sustainable transportation manipulating it and going a completely different way with the investment and planning for sustainable transportation. We also believe that when there's not a universal definition in law, it creates so much confusion by stakeholders, especially members of the public. So as of right now, it really does require someone with the professional and educational experiences to understand what sustainable transportation is by going through and looking at prior universal definitions of sustainability and so forth, and see how that applies to the transportation sector and the transportation perspective as well. And so we feel that codifying sustainable transportation will do the opposite. It will create a uniform and democratized term for everyone to understand, and also, most importantly, for individuals to hold planners and elected officials to account for with this universal definition. So as we mentioned, that was mailed to Governor Newsom on the 22nd. We also included 7 other CCs on it who are very important with the potential administration of sustainable transportation investment and planning. One of them include Eleni Kounikalakis. She's actually our 50th Lieutenant Governor. Jim Beal Jr., he's the chair of the Senate Committee on Transportation and also a state senator for District 15. Jim Frazier, he's the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee and Assembly member for District 11. Hilda L. Solis, she's actually currently the first district supervisor for the Los Angeles County. And we included her because this is based on her monumental effort began in 1995. So from 1995 to 1999, then Senator Solis actually led the effort to have codified the term environmental justice. This was based on President Clinton's executive order issued the 11th of February, 1994. And it eventually came to being through Senate Bill 115, which created Government Code Section 65040.12 subsection C and Section 672,000 subsection A of the Public Resources Code, which now defined what environmental justice was. It's changed over the years, but at the same time, California was the first state to enact a definition of environmental justice, and naturally, we now have the most robust program for environmental justice administered through the Environmental Protection Agency, plus we have within the Department of Justice an entire bureau devoted to environmental justice and related environmental crimes. So that again is the power behind why we're trying to have codified in statute the term sustainable transportation. So there is a foundation for it, and we could go forward with increasing it, whatever is needed to actually make sure that sustainable transportation is being invested in and planned. And again, but planners are being held accountable to. And then as far as the administration, we also sent it to David S. Kim. He's the secretary of the California State Transportation Agency. Jared Blumenfeld, he's actually Secretary of the California Environmental Protection Agency. And lastly, Yolanda Richardson, she's the Secretary of the Government Operations Agency. And she's included because her agency oversees the Department of General Services, which oversees the state's transportation fleet. And from my understanding, there's about 35,000 plus vehicles in the state fleet. So it's kind of a no-brainer and strategic that we would include Secretary Richardson in this correspondence. So in addition to that, we also sent a separate letter the day after to 6 members of the legislature, key members as well. I'll discuss who the members are in a second. And we included in it a template for model legislation for defining sustainable transportation that included our definition and also the reasoning behind it, which is usually needed for what's called the Legislative Council's Digest, and that is the framework, the template for legislation in California. So in addition to our original letter, we also explained essentially what the campaign was in regards to and how we believe it's very powerful that we have defined the term sustainable transportation. So again, we sent it to 6 members of the legislature, very key. The first was Dr. Richard Pan. He's actually the state senator for Senate District 6, which is actually the district that encompasses CalGreen's headquarters in downtown Sacramento. We also sent it to Assemblymember Kevin McCarthy. He's the member of Assembly for the 7th District, which oversees Sacramento, again, CalGreen's headquarters. We sent it to Jim Beal Jr., Chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, Patricia Bates, Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Transportation and a Senator for District 36, Jim Frazier, Chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee, and lastly to Vince Fong, Vice Chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee and a Assembly member for District 34. So these are the individuals that the members of the legislature that were sent to, and we're hoping to more action for it. We understand right now that the legislature is very busy working hard on, solving California's multi-billion-dollar deficit due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But if we hear anything, any feedback or any results, further information from our campaign and specifically from these letters, we'll keep you updated in future episodes of the podcast. So if you, again, as we mentioned, we'll keep you updated, but you can also go online right now to get more information. And that's at the website, www.casustainabletransport.info. Again, that is www.casustainabletransport.info. And in the meantime, between podcasts, the latest information will be included on that website. And again, if you need that address, you can also go online to our podcast website and download the PowerPoints and the slides for this presentation where you can get more information. And now lastly in our podcast, we actually wanted to bring attention to a very notable piece of legislation that's in the House of Representatives right now, and that's House Resolution 1024. It was actually introduced in January by Representative Barbara Lee. She's the member of the House for California's 13th District, which is located in the East Bay, and its principal jurisdiction is Oakland. So House Resolution 1024 was introduced to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and also to have the administration put forward other events and, celebrations of what the UN has brought to the US and in particular into the world with regards to peace and peacekeeping affairs in its 75 years. So as you know, the UN is headquartered in the city of New York, but it was actually born in the city of San Francisco on June 26, 1945, following a week-long International Committee on Organization. So the official anniversary date will take place October 24th this year. But again, House Resolution 1024 is calling for the U.S. to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the UN and recognize the achievements that the UN has brought to our country and also to the world overall. Now, if you want to have your member of the House of Representatives support the bill as well, you can go to the House's official website. That's www.house.gov. Again, that's house.gov. And when you're on the front page, on the upper right side, you'll see a box that says Find Your Representative. And there you'll put in your 5-digit zip code. And from there, like with CalGreen Academy is 95814, from there it will generate your representative. So we're in downtown Sacramento. Our representative is Doris Matsui. She's the member for the 6th District of California with a primary jurisdiction of the city of Sacramento. However, if you are located on or near the boundary of another member's district, it may notify you by giving you 2 members' information. So you actually have to put in more information such as your street address and city and so forth. And then from there, it will give you the exact member that you're looking for. So again, that is House Resolution 1024. We are asking you to take the time to have your member of the House of Representatives please support the bill. It does a wonderful job at paying the much earned attention and respect that the United Nations deserves in its 75 years of peacekeeping and other efforts to help humanity and human rights. Thank you for joining me on the second episode of the Countdown to 2030 podcast, brought to you by the California Green Academy. Please join me for next month's episode as I discuss the United Nations 75th anniversary taking place this 24th of October, in addition to CalGreen's and other local celebration plans. I'll also be discussing in detail the United Nations Association's UN 75 consultation report and its potential impact on the future of UN-US relations, followed by a breakdown of the UN's 2020 Sustainable Development Goals Progress Report issued earlier this month. As always, for further information, please visit our website at www.countdown-to2030.dev. This podcast is provided to you absolutely free by the California Green Academy, a nonprofit 501c3 organization. If you would like to support the podcast or CalGreen, 100% tax-deductible donations can be made securely online at www.calgreenacademy.org/donate. On behalf of the California Green Academy, I'm Greg Justice, your host for the podcast and Chief Sustainability Officer for CalGreen. Before we go, in the spirit of Sustainable Development Goal number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages, during this pandemic, we ask you to stay home, stay safe, and please remember to wear a face mask. Thanks again for joining us today, and in the words of the United Nations, it's your world.